Welcome back to Team Focus USA. My name is Darius Harris. In today's interview, we have Joe Gottfried, former basketball coach and athletic director at the University of South Alabama. Sit back and I hope you enjoy some of these stories from this interview. Hey, I want to welcome our guest, Joe Gottfried, longtime head basketball coach at the University of Ashland, University of Southern Illinois, and the University of South Alabama athletic director for 26 years.
Darius, glad to be here.
We're here to dive into these questions. Everyone has a story, so we're here to hear yours.
Look forward to it.
You grew up in a small town, 5,000 people. What was that like?
It was a great community to grow up in. You never locked your doors at night. People got along. The sports were excellent, and the people in the community cared. So it was really a great time in the 50s to grow up.
When you were a young man, your dad, Fritz, took you to a basketball game. He gave you some advice. What was that advice?
I remember I was in the 7th grade, and he took me to watch the Crestline High School varsity team. And I'll never forget, he said, pick out a player that you think not only may be the best player, but may have the best attitude. Watch when he's on the court, watch when he's off the court. And then if that's the one you really like, that's you want to emulate and try to be like him. And make sure he's a team player as well. So he asked me to look for these things, which obviously he helped me. I'm only in the 7th grade. And I remember that as if it was yesterday.
April 3rd, 1956. Can you go into detail of what happened that morning?
Well, we were sleeping through the evening, and then all of a sudden, approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, I heard a thud. And wasn't sure what it was, and got out of bed and took off and looked in the bathroom, and my mom was holding my dad, and my dad had collapsed and did not know at that particular time that he had a massive heart attack. But prior to that, Mom says, go find Dr. Brandt. And Dr. Brandt only lived about a block and a half from us. So I rushed down to his house and knocked and pounded on the door until he came to the door, and I told him what had happened. He immediately said, ride with me. I said, no, I'll just run back to the house because it's only a block and a half. So he came, and by the time he got there, my dad had passed away.
What lessons did you learn from that, and how did it affect you?
It was interesting. The night before, he took me to the bowling alley, and we played pool. And obviously I couldn't beat him in pool. And so I got mad one time. I said, I quit. I'm not playing anymore. And he grabbed me by the shoulder. He said, don't you ever say quit. And it was 4 or 5 hours later that he passed, but I never forgot what he said. And I've passed that on to, former players and colleagues and my own kids, grandkids, whatever, how important it is to never give up.
You played 4 sports in high school. What was your favorite?
Probably at that time, whatever sport I was playing seemed like the favorite, but probably basketball and football were two, that I had a passion for, and that I always wanted to coach basketball, though.
Okay. As a junior, you guarded a soon-to-be pro basketball player.
Unfortunately, I can't say he guarded me, but I did guard him. And him was Larry Siegfried, who played at Shelby High School and played at Ohio State when they won the national championship, started 3 years, and had about a 13-year career in the NBA. And he was 6'4", and I'm 5'9". And Coach told me, he says, and both teams were undefeated, and we're playing them in Shelby, and they were standing outside the door at 3 o'clock, ready to get in. We were a small school, and Shelby was a big school. And he told me, he says, our best player, Larry Simmemacher, was first team All-Ohio. He said, I don't want him guarding Siegfried, because I don't want him to wear out. We need his 33 points. He said, I need you to sacrifice your offense. So I did, 5'9", 6'4", and I held him to 58. But I want to phrase that. He had 60 the week before, so I felt I did pretty well.
I agree. Your senior year, your team lost the opener. What did your coach tell you?
We were predominantly a senior team. Probably 4 starters at that time were seniors, and I'll never forget that. He was a first-year coach at our place. Not a first-year head coach, but in our place, that was his first year. And we really didn't know him really well, having played under, he was a backfield coach in football, so I got to know him a little bit. But we lost at Bucyrus, and he said, if we don't have a winning record by Christmas, the 4 seniors are gone. And got my attention very quick. And we ended up proceeded to win 21 in a row and lost our last one.
Oh, wow.
So his message resonated with all of us.
I would expect so. You signed out of high school to Kent State to play quarterback, but you also got on the freshman basketball team.
And that was interesting. It was a freshman basketball team was really outstanding. And during that time, Bill Burtka was the head basketball coach who ended up being the Lakers assistant coach for 20 years. And but football went through the fall football season as a quarterback, and then they'd already been practicing for 3 weeks in basketball when I was able to. They allowed me to try out for the basketball team. Fortunately, I ended up making the 12-man squad, and so that was pretty exciting because a couple of those players played in the NBA later on.
Joe, after hearing that from your coach, how did your team rally behind that?
Well, I remember we got together shortly after. There were actually 5 of us, but 4 starters. And I remember we said, going to play as hard as we possibly can and, see what we can make out of this. Because the year before we lost 3 starters. And we were going up in a class. Instead of going down, we were going to be in a higher level. But we were all mature, we were all seniors. So from a standpoint, we had some maturity. And, fortunately, we just were able to come together and play. And he was an outstanding basketball coach, and we had some good underclassmen, so it ended up being a great year.
So, Joe, since not having anyone to talk to you about that, how did that affect you as far as coaching and you being a leader and mentoring your teams?
Well, I knew what I went through, what I was going through at that particular time, and I tried to, even with Mike when he was at Moorhead, and Mom called me and said that he wanted to drop out of school. And I took off that night, went down because I knew what I went through. And I didn't have anybody there, to talk, that I could talk with or talk, about or ask a question. So I've always been conscious of kids over the years, whether there were ones that I coached or grandkids or my own children. And Mark, for example, was going to drop out of school at one particular time. And so we rushed to Tulsa, Oklahoma, to talk to him about that. So it had an effect on me.
What happened that made you want to go into coaching and teaching?
Probably 2 things. Number one, my dad always wanted to be a coach. Mm-hmm. He was a railroad engineer, and I always wanted to be a railroad engineer. He wanted to be a coach. Well, we got our roles, different. And I always knew I wanted to coach. And in order to be able to be a high school coach, you have to be able to teach. So I went into education and got a teaching certificate in English and taught English for 8 years in high school and coached high school basketball.
Looking back, who are your mentors?
I like to think we grew up in a small community, and Merle Hudson was the coach for, I didn't play for him, but I grew up watching him coach older guys, or older than me. And so he was one of the people I idolized. And then whoever my high school coach was, football, baseball, basketball, I always loved those guys and how they worked with the kids. So they were all my mentors.
How did that exactly influence you, watching those guys?
Well, I saw how close they were to the student athletes and how close they were to the faculty, student faculty. And so that it was kind of role models for me to watch them. And I, like I mentioned, I liked my high school coaches. The one thing I learned from them too, they were all disciplinarians. And so that's one of the traits that I think has always been one of my strengths. And they all cared for one another. And I thought they cared for the athletes that they were coaching as well. So I was very fortunate. I didn't have any bad coaches growing up.
What is one of the most important attributes of a coach?
I think one of the things that I always felt as a coach, the players have to trust you, and they have to feel that you care. And I think if you get those traits where they trust you and they know that you care, I think it's easier to coach them. And I think the mutual respect is greater when you have those 2 characteristics.
When you transferred from Kent State to Ashland, you didn't take the victim mentality. Why?
The reason I didn't, because I knew what I wanted to do. I knew that I had some goals, and I knew it was going to be a rough road now because I had to fund the scholarship myself. And then also got married at that particular time, and my wife started to work, but I found a job in Crestline working on the railroad, and I was every night from 11 to 7. Then I'd get in my car and drive 30 miles to go to Ashland College, where I was going to school. And then I went to class during the day and practiced basketball, and then hour sleep, and I'm back driving 30 more miles, working 11 to 7. Did that for 2 years, 2.5 years in the middle of the winter. And but I knew it, and I had to go to the bank and borrow money. We just kept going to the bank and borrow money and start pay it back. And we did this for 5 years. And fortunately, I got the degree then, and the rest, did well. We did well.
Okay. You didn't feel sorry for yourself. Why?
I think the reason being is I always knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a coach, and I knew I've got to make a lot of sacrifices. And that working was hard. I mean, I would never advise anybody to do it. But one thing I learned from it, and I told former athletes and students that I had, don't tell me you can't go to college because your parents can't afford to send you. I mean, if you have a goal in mind, you can make it work. I'm a good example of that. I didn't really like doing it, but didn't have a choice.
Of course. Your kids, Mark, Christy, what did you and Mary want to teach them in life?
I think one of the big things you do a lot of things by example that they learn, through, watching, the parents. But I think one of the things we always wanted to teach them is integrity, be honest. And especially Mark wanted to coach and Christy wanted to be a teacher, that your group always understands that you care for them, you care about them, and you're there available, for the students. So I think the caring attitude is what we probably stress more than anything, by example.
What is some advice, 1 or 2 points, that you would give some young people?
I think that maybe the most important thing, that you have discipline in your life, that you learn how to discipline yourself, and value your time. And I think probably those were characteristics that I always taught my basketball team. The fact that discipline, you've got to have some discipline, and you've got to be able to accept a role, whether it's teaching or whether it's coaching or whether it's playing. So I think those were probably some of the strong feelings I had.
You mentioned role. On every team, there's a role somebody has to play.
I think the one thing that I always did right initially when I had a team, and even when I was a director of athletics for 26 years at South Alabama, is the fact that there's going to be roles that we all have to play. And it may not be right away that we define that role that you're going to have, much like I don't always define the role that my staff had. But as we move along, you will have a role to play, and you will know what that role is. Much like I have a role to play with the university, and coaches have a role to each other. So I think accepting a role-playing position or appointment or whatever it may be, you have to learn to be able to do your role to be able to be successful.
In a family, everyone has a role. What is some advice that you'll give a person?
Well, let's say you've got 2 or 3 children, and your wife has a role, and I as a husband have a role, and as a dad I have a role. And then we try to teach our kids that you have a role to play, whether it's studying at night, whether it's cleaning your room, or whatever it may be, that we're going to define those roles so everyone knows where they stand in a family.
As a longtime coach, can you expand on the importance of actually playing your role in a team?
I will. And let's take a team, for example. I was a basketball coach. Once you determine what role you're going to play and what role A is going to play and another guy's going to play, but the role playing is so important, from the managers to the superintendent, to the pep band. Those are all role playing to be able to have a successful program. I'll give you an example. My last 3 years coaching in high school at a small rural school, we were 59-10, and had a kid. One of the players was first team All-State. But I made that team feel like those 2 managers that were with us as sophomores, juniors, and seniors were just as important as he was, the first team All-State. And the players all developed that everybody has an important part to play. And I use the superintendent of schools as well. He had a role to play. And your families have a role to play. So once you can determine what those roles are, you've got a chance to be more successful.
As a coach, it's hard to be on the bench. It's hard to not start. How do you address that guy that may have a problem with that?
Let me come back and say that if you've only ever been a starter, you really don't know what the young guys or girls sitting on the bench, what role, how they feel. And I had the fortune in high school, started 3 straight years on my high school basketball team. But when I got to college, I wasn't a starter. So I learned another role that you're not playing as important role as you may have played previously. So I understood how that player feels. So I always treated the players that weren't playing as much as well as I tried to do with the players that were starting.
Okay.
So they all felt a part of the team.
Okay. Who was one of the best athletes you've ever coached?
You know, I could cite a number of them, but what I'd rather do, because I've had a lot of good ones, but I can tell you who was the best one I coached against ever, and that was Larry Bird, French Lick, Indiana.
Wow.
Played against him 3 times while I was a basketball coach at SIU. They were 33-1. They lost their last game of the year to Michigan State, Magic Johnson. It was a Magic and Bird, game. And when we played against him 3 times, and all 3 times he was the difference in the game. They beat us by 9, by 7, and by 3. And I learned how good he really was. I didn't know that he would be one of the top 50 all time, but he was outstanding.
Okay. What made him good?
Well, first off, he had good size. He was 6'9", maybe about 230. Didn't have your foot speed, but he was so deceiving. He could shoot, he could pass, and he understood the game. He was probably a 4-point student in basketball, but really a competitor too. And if you put somebody on him tight that was quick, he'd go right around them. If you sloughed off of him, he'd shoot the jumper, much like he did in the NBA for 15 years, I think.
I really hope you enjoyed this interview thus far with Joe Gottfried. Tune in for part 2 later on this week.